I would say now is the worst time in decades to be a Doctor Who fan. After 2 seasons of what should have been a fresh reboot with a fresh talent, Ncuti Gatwa playing the titular role, and a deal with Disney that brought a massive budget to the show's production and making the show available internationally through their streaming service Disney+, it is now uncertain that the show will be renewed for a new season under this deal, or a new season at all. In late 2023 to early 2024, I had hoped that the show would finally return to quality under Russell T Davies, often abbreviated to his initials RTD, the showrunner that brought us peak Doctor Who from 2005 to 2010, with Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant, that brought the show into immense popularity and featured some of the best writing and most iconic episodes in the show's history. This hope I had came after a pretty rough few years under showrunner Chris Chibnall. This era is widely thought of to be lacking in quality, with some pretty awful and unmemorable episodes, horrible writing in some instances, alongside decreasing popularity. But this hope I had slowly burnt out with this new era, as recent seasons weren't exactly the dramatic increase in popularity that we were all waiting for, and leading the show into most likely a long hiatus and possibly cancellation. This video will include a collection of my thoughts as to why this era failed to revive the state of Doctor Who, and why it has led to the least promising time to be a fan of the series.
And the marvellous thing is the past 61 years don't matter. It's here, it's now, it's new, it's fresh, it's for you.
In October 2022, it was announced that a deal would be made with Disney, resulting in Doctor Who being streamed outside the UK on Disney+, as well as Disney providing a boost in the show's budget. This was also right at the time that The Power of the Doctor aired, the last episode under Chris Chibnall, and the last featuring Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor. As previously mentioned, this era declined in ratings and was a significant reduction in popularity, with undeniably the most famous and popular actor back in their title role for 3 specials, future series being executively produced by Russell T Davies, and the series now being available worldwide. This was promising, as me and many other fans were convinced that the show would return to quality and popularity, with a brand new audience of fans being introduced to the show. This optimism stayed intact through the show's 60th anniversary specials featuring David Tennant's 14th Doctor. While I wasn't a fan of the first special and thought the third was decent with some problems, I thought special number 2, Wild Blue Yonder, showcased some of the show's best writing in years. The pacing of the story is perfect. It sees the Doctor and companion Donna Noble stranded on a spaceship that is entirely isolated. For most of the episode, they're completely on their own, allowing for some amazing character moments, and winds down the action a little bit, giving the audience a break between 2 pretty action-filled specials. Of course, by this point the Disney deal hadn't set in, but the rising quality that I was promised was certainly fulfilled, at least to an extent. It was finally when Tennant bi-generated into the 15th Doctor, Ncuti Gatwa, that the Disney deal came into place. Future series from this point would be under this deal, and judging from the high ratings that the 60th anniversary specials got, it would seem that the deal would be here to stay for many more. Instead of being called Series 14, Gatwa's first series would be marketed as Season 1. Seemingly, this provided a fresh start, a complete modern reboot that new viewers could jump onto without having the knowledge of the details of previous seasons to understand. This was presumably done because the Whittaker era had been very lore-heavy, especially in Series 12 and 13, and the new reboot under Gatwa and RTD could essentially leave that behind to focus on new story elements, as well as the fact that, because Doctor Who would now be streaming on Disney Plus worldwide, many viewers internationally would be watching the show for the very first time, and wouldn't understand what a flux or a timeless child are, and wouldn't have to educate themselves on the lore that the last 2 seasons built up. It proposes a few problems, however. Firstly, it would leave the story arcs essentially open-ended. As much as they are hated by a lot of fans, the story features of the Chibnall-Whittaker era have so much potential to be explored further. A new reboot would leave these at a dead end. Secondly, how do you both cater to new audiences that have never watched the show before, while also not boring people that have been watching for years? Hardcore fans of Doctor Who wouldn't want to watch reboot after reboot, having the main character introduce the basic elements of the show again and again. Long-time fans of the show would also yearn for older characters, enemies and settings to be brought up, as they may be familiar with these features of the show's past and would love to see them return in a modern setting. It's because Doctor Who has so many fans that have been watching for differing numbers of years as to why it's essentially impossible to make the show go through a full reboot. In this section of the video, I will explain how the RTD2 era completely fails to solve this second dilemma, and while it certainly has standalone moments that new fans can enjoy, it mainly serves to attract people who are already fans of the show. During the 2005 reboot, RTD was faced with a similar problem, except Series 1, that is the series that aired in 2005, not 2024, see how confusing that is? Handled it quite well. Even though Series 1 includes villains from the classic era, such as the Autons and Daleks, the inclusion of these elements wasn't convoluted, and exists to maintain the show's core elements, while at the same time being fresh and new. The Daleks and the Cybermen were the main classic villains that were brought back for the show's first 2 seasons in 2005 and 2006, and I feel like they kind of exist in the broader public consciousness, especially the Daleks. If you're not a Doctor Who fan, then you still know what a Dalek is. They're part of the DNA of the show and have been since the very start. They're what made the show popular, so will always be associated with it. Now, let's compare this with how the modern reboot of the show handles this problem. I'm going to assume that the new international audience is going to start watching with the 2023 Christmas special and Gatwa's first episode as the Doctor, The Church on Ruby Road, and will continue with seasons 1 and 2. From this point, I'll refer to the 2024 series as Series 14 and the 2025 series as Series 15, just to avoid confusion. Instead of using iconic villains from the show's history, it decides, for the Series 14 finale, to bring back a relatively obscure villain, Sutekh, from the 1975 serial Pyramids of Mars. Now, I don't have much of a problem with this on its own, but it seems that RTD is stuck in a conundrum in which he included Sutekh to please the hardcore, long-lasting fans of the show. But when it actually comes to execution, it seems like there's this necessity to just exposition dump halfway through a climactic finale, just in case the new viewers don't understand what's going on. Series 14's finale, Empire of Death, slows down the plot dramatically in its second act to literally have the 2 main characters sit down and watch Pyramids of Mars on a tablet. It seems like RTD is hesitant to either appeal to new viewers or long-time fans. This happens with the Series 15 finale, The Reality War as well. This time, the recurring obscure classic Who villain is the Rani and Omega. I would elaborate, but I don't want to. In the middle of the finale, there's, similarly to Empire of Death, an excruciatingly long scene of all the main characters explaining who these villains are. This horrible reliance on exposition is part of the problem. Fans of the show don't want a long-winded explanation of things that they already know, and I'm not sure new viewers want this either. They mostly want fast-paced action and fun, not to learn about the show's lore that dates back 40 to 50 years. They probably don't give a shit who Omega or the Rani are, only that they're old enemies that the Doctor has faced in the past. Okay, but the new audience doesn't need to know exactly every detail about Sutekh, the Rani or Omega to understand what's going on then. Old fans can still point and cheer at the fact that their favourite character has returned after decades, and the new viewers aren't that confused and can watch without being entirely lost, I hear you scream. Not exactly. I would still argue that this era aggressively calls back to the show's past in a way that is basically impossible for a new viewer to watch without asking what or who's that every few episodes. By the end of Series 15, it's every 1 episode, and convinces me that this era is not a reboot at all and is pretty much only for old viewers. This mostly applies to Series 15. Episode 3, The Well, is almost a sequel to the 2008 episode Midnight, as it features the same villain and the same setting. Midnight is almost a fan favourite episode, having the Doctor face a mysterious entity in one small set. The whole thing's done on a small budget, but the writing is wonderful and it creates a really eerie atmosphere, as well as an excellent narrative. The decision to make this episode a sequel to Midnight is of course to please the show's fans that would be aware of the episode Midnight, something that an international viewer that started watching with the Disney era might not know anything about. This alone is a pretty bad idea for what's supposed to be a reboot, even more so if you consider the fact that the episode literally doesn't need to be set in the same location as Midnight. It's a perfectly fine story on its own, and the Midnight entity that's shown is basically a completely different thing. I, however, wouldn't have as much of a problem with this decision if the rest of the series didn't keep referencing the show's past again and again and again. 2 episodes later, The Fugitive Doctor, a past, non-numerical incarnation of the Doctor that was part of the 13th Doctor's story arc, shows up as a cameo. The next episode, Susan Foreman, the Doctor's granddaughter and first ever companion, shows up as a cameo. And the episode after that, the Rani is the main antagonist, as well as Omega being mentioned as the bombshell surprise villain. And the episode after that, the 13th Doctor appears for no reason to talk to 15. Now, as a fan, I liked seeing these actors reprise their roles as characters from the show's previous seasons, but I felt like the latter half of Series 15 was just a cameo fest, what some people might call fan service, where the show just keeps bringing back characters that fans will recognise after they haven't appeared for a while, just to hype them up. It started happening so much that I just got bored of it, like it felt as if the show couldn't focus on new opportunities, settings, characters or storylines because it's so interested in referencing itself. Sure, a new viewer could just brush these things off as, oh, I suppose this is just an old character from a series that I haven't watched. These cameos don't require the knowledge of who they are in order for you to understand what's going on, but I bet it still confuses the hell out of most of new viewers, and I don't even blame RTD for this, really. Doctor Who is a show that, because of this problem, is essentially impossible to reboot for a new audience because its fanbase is so immensely large and they don't want a clean slate. Series 11 with Jodie Whittaker was supposed to do this. It contained no past elements of the show, and honestly, I didn't like this decision. It didn't feel like Doctor Who at all, because at this point the show essentially exists for the fans, and why would they want to start watching the show with a modern reboot when, in my opinion, Series 1 from 2005 is the perfect starting point, simply because I just think it's way better made, but more on that later. Ultimately, to sum up this chapter of the video essay, one reason why this new era of Doctor Who fails is because it's not exactly sure what it's supposed to be. It markets itself as a fresh restart, wiping the slate clean for the show's convoluted storylines that it has set up. But at the core, it mainly serves to please people who have been watching for years, and leaves the show in a pretty sticky position, where pretty much one of the only people who are guaranteed to watch are these viewers, the built-in audience who have familiarised themselves with it for such a long time.
You just hope it'll generate content.
So we've discussed how the show is now only for the pre-existing audience of fans, but what if the show loses its quality altogether, and this very group of viewers starts becoming bored or even starts disliking the show? That's essentially what happened from 2018 to 2022. As I previously described, the Chibnall-Whittaker era was largely seen as a downgrade by fans, and while it did have its fans, there was a lot of collective enjoyment back in September 2021 when RTD was announced to be coming back to the show. And then in May 2022, it was announced that David Tennant would be returning to the show for its 60th anniversary specials. When it was confirmed that he would be playing the 14th incarnation of the Doctor, it sparked varying reactions. Most people were excited, as of course he is by far the most beloved Doctor of them all, and nostalgia factor comes into this excitement massively, as a lot of these fans remembered him from their childhoods. Despite this, others were kind of questioning Tennant's casting, deeming it a stunt cast or an example of nostalgia bait, but there wasn't an overall negative consensus. David Tennant returning as the Doctor was excusable, as it was essentially a one-off incarnation of the character for the 60th anniversary, and then after that the show can go in a different direction and we can all move on, right? Less than 2 years after these specials, Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor, in his final episode, regenerates into Billie Piper. Now, I'm not going to assume that Piper is playing an incarnation of the Doctor, because that hasn't been confirmed yet. We cannot be sure. Actually, neither can RTD. But anyway, the inclusion of Billie Piper as the person that the Doctor regenerates into was a last-minute decision to replace Gatwa when he decided to leave. I'll elaborate on that more in the third section of this video, but what happened was, the Series 15 finale had reshoots in February 2025 to film the 15th Doctor's exit, and Billie Piper's scene was filmed hastily in front of a green screen in London, a separate location. This prompted, unlike before, a wide consensus among fans that Piper's impromptu casting reeked of desperation, and that the show physically couldn't move in any direction without digging out older elements from its past. If you didn't know, then Billie Piper portrayed Rose Tyler, the Doctor's main companion from 2005 to 2006, an era of the show which many fans reminisce on and have a lot of nostalgia for. I discussed the concept of fan service in the first segment, and the inclusion of Billie Piper is the final ultimate indicator that the show is now almost entirely reliant on it, but I'm not even sure the majority of fans like this decision at all. Then who is this decision for? I think some of the general population, and especially some people who may have watched the show 20 years ago as a child, will remember Billie Piper being in it. So I believe this casting is a last-minute desperate attempt to try and attract as many of this audience as possible, as well as having fans generate content online, the perfect way to try and hope to get the show back to popularity. It's the same thing as casting David Tennant as the 14th Doctor. Both fans and casual audiences who hadn't been watching for 15 years shared their excitement, as these characters and actors were popular features of the show back in its golden era. But for how long can you do this before it starts to get stale, and people will see through the nostalgia to realise that, well, the show's actually not doing that well? To me, that kind of already happened, and it's never been more obvious. The whole situation reminds me so much of the casting of Robert Downey Jr. as Doctor Doom in the upcoming Avengers Doomsday. It's not controversial to say that the MCU has been going through quite a rough patch for the past 4 years, and what did the producers decide to do? Cast someone who is synonymous with the franchise's most popular and beloved era. This promotes the film while having people more encouraged to go watch it, as they remember Tony Stark, they remember when Marvel used to be good, and they remember when they were younger and life used to be easier and more fun. But this is just a veil. Billie Piper's casting is such an obvious sign that the show is doing so poorly that instead of hiring any new talent, they reintroduce an old companion in hopes to rekindle interest in the show. You've got to remember that Series 15 got some of the lowest viewership in the show's history, with lows such as 2.7 million consolidated and 1.5 million overnight. These may seem high, and they are, but for Doctor Who standards, a show which just 7 to 8 years ago was reaching highs of 6 to 7 million consolidated figures and around 5 to 6 million overnight figures on average, they're poor to say the least. Not to mention that this is literally less than 2 years after an old Doctor was brought back to play a new incarnation. Having Gatwa's 15th Doctor be bookended by nostalgia-bait stunt casts, which is really sad, as I don't want that to be what he ends up being remembered for. And one of the big things that this era will end up being remembered for is the constant persistence to bring back things which made the show so good and memorable decades ago. That is, if Billie is actually playing a new incarnation of the Doctor. But for me, that doesn't really matter. Her casting is a desperate stunt either way, and may be the final nail in the coffin for the show. It creates a position where the show's writers and producers can either keep nostalgia baiting the audience for years on end, and the show just becomes purely self-referential to the point where it features no new elements, but rather callbacks to its past to please fans and casual childhood fans. Or it could try and be original and unique, but it would likely lose its popularity even more. I'll discuss that later, but for now I want to discuss how we got to the point that we did in the reality war. Why was the 15th Doctor's era, despite being full of promise, so short-lived?
Why did you walk away?
Because I'm getting old and my body was tired.
It wouldn't be much of an understatement to say that Ncuti Gatwa's departure as the 15th Doctor was impromptu, unexpected and messy. It was clear that the reality war was always supposed to have an alternate ending, but Gatwa's sudden departure from the role meant that the episode had to be rewritten and reshot, which honestly makes the story even more convoluted than it already was. His era was cut down to 2 short seasons of 8 episodes each, and his tenure as the Doctor coming to an end now means that some of the most important story arcs that were set up during his era won't be properly resolved. For example, in the 6th episode of Series 14, the Doctor falls in love with a bounty hunter by the name of Rogue, who sacrifices himself by transporting himself in an unknown alternate dimension. By the end of the story, the Doctor is heartbroken and committed to finding him. As Gatwa's incarnation is the only one that Rogue is familiar with, this storyline can no longer be properly concluded in my opinion. Throughout the 15th Doctor's era, the Doctor's granddaughter Susan is mentioned, first in the 2nd episode of Series 14, The Devil's Chord, and then appears as a cameo in the Doctor's subconscious in the Interstellar Song Contest from Series 15. Leaks regarding Series 15's initial planned ending report that Susan would make a final appearance in the flesh, hinting that the Doctor would finally reunite with her in the next season. But, as 15's era has now ended, this story arc would probably not be explored further. A 3rd and final season featuring Gatwa's Doctor would have him reunite with Rogue and Susan, wrapping up the plot elements of his era nicely, except this is now not the case. It also means that we've had 3 regenerations in the space of 3 years, Whittaker into Tennant, Tennant into Gatwa, and then Gatwa into Piper. It would have been nice for the 15th Doctor's era to last at least a couple more years, to slow the pace down a little bit after a bit of a turbulent period where the show was going through constant change, as well as the fact that 15 only got 18 episodes, a tiny amount of screen time compared to the other Doctors. In interviews, Gatwa has stated that it has always been the plan to leave at this point, so it might seem like in this section I'm blaming him for exiting the role and leaving these story elements as loose ends. But in reality, I don't think he's to blame at all. As of August 2025, the show is still waiting to be renewed for a new season, and I'm sure that will happen, but for Ncuti Gatwa, a young actor in high demand for other projects that would pay him far more than his role in Doctor Who, it's difficult for him to sit around and wait for this renewal. This was demonstrated quite clearly during Series 14, where Gatwa played a minimal part during 2 episodes, as during the first block of filming, he was busy still filming the final series of Sex Education, a Netflix show which is possibly more relevant than Doctor Who is right now, and in which Gatwa is probably more famous for featuring in. From an acting perspective, it really does make sense for Gatwa to leave the role and be open and available for other, bigger projects instead of waiting for Doctor Who to be renewed for a 16th series, in case filming for Doctor Who clashes with another acting job. To really illustrate how in demand Gatwa was for other roles, allegedly he was asked to do a perfume advert which would have paid him more than an entire series of Doctor Who, but had to turn it down. Ncuti is still at the beginning of his acting career, and being in Sex Education as well as featuring in the Barbie movie, one of the biggest films of 2023, realistically cannot spend years playing the titular role in Doctor Who, as it's obvious that he's wanted for bigger projects as soon as possible. As much as his era was cut short, I do however think that Gatwa was the perfect casting for the 15th Doctor. His incarnation is fundamentally different from previous Doctors, as he bi-generated from 14, a Doctor that represents an embodiment of the Doctor's collected past trauma, an incarnation that has been through so much and has bottled it up to the point where he is burnt out. The process of bi-generation lets 14 retire and take time away from the hectic life he once lived to allow 15 to continue and not be burdened by the past, which arguably is tossed out the window completely when he regenerates into a former companion, but I digress. This allows the 15th Doctor to be more emotional, learning that he is able to express what he's feeling, openly crying and admitting to being vulnerable at times. The 15th Doctor is a changed man, an exuberant, emotive and proudly human Doctor, except the show isn't built for that. Doctor Who is about change, remaining relevant and, most importantly, continuing no matter what. To continue, the Doctor must remain as an alien, with thousands of years behind him and not being entirely human. This is a fault of the Doctor's character that he has pointed out before. An immortal Time Lord cannot commit themselves to a human companionship forever, and this contrast between what has always been the main characters, the Doctor and their human acquaintances, is a central opposing structure that has driven the narrative of the show since its inception. While I did enjoy watching Series 14 and 15, I wouldn't have minded if the show had ended with the 60th anniversary specials as a sort of finale, with the Doctor learning to stop bottling up his emotions as well as learning to be more human, finally retiring and living on Earth, a planet which he's had a keen interest in for so long. Doctor Who, however, is not a show that has a limited run and an eventual end. Part of its remit is longevity, constantly rebranding and rebooting every few years, but also keeping its main character the same. It's this element of the show that I think Gatwa's era is missing, and I think the move to a more human and emotive Doctor should have happened as 15's era went on. He should have started exactly like his predecessor and become this way throughout the series. If the show is going to end now, then I think the finale should have been the Doctor letting go of all this past trauma, except that happened too early, and we were left with a Doctor that didn't have the capacity for such character development. The 12th Doctor, played by Peter Capaldi, is my personal favourite Doctor. He starts his era off being a more grumpy and morally uncertain incarnation, but by his 3rd season learns to connect with his companions better and prioritise kindness. 12's character develops clearly throughout his era, meanwhile 15 starts exactly the same as how he ends. The 15th Doctor's era feels different in another way, however, and that is the change from more traditional sci-fi elements to the show having more fantasy elements, and how that has a major impact on the quality of the writing.
At the edge of the universe, where the walls are thin and all things are possible.
The main structure of this new era of Doctor Who, as I've explained, is definitely a problem. But if you look past it, is the actual writing any good? The RTD2 era is different from the show's past, in the sense that it distances itself from the sci-fi genre and revolves around fantasy elements. In World Beyonder, the 14th Doctor invokes a superstition at the very edge of the universe, where he separates him and Donna from the Not Things, alien entities that take the form of him and his companion, in hopes that they won't be able to cross a line of salt. At the end of the episode, he regrets this decision. Somehow, invoking a superstition at the edge of space will allow for something paranormal to take effect in the universe. This is the first of many subjective parts of the writing that will come to be more present in this era. Simple and subjective solutions to problems that the Doctor encounters that are explained away easily with the excuse that this is a fantasy show now is definitely my main problem with what goes on to be the 15th Doctor's era. The decision in Wild Blue Yonder introduces the main threat of Gatwa's era, the Pantheon of Gods, and the first instance of this lazy writing, for me, was first really evident in Series 14, Episode 2, The Devil's Chord, when battling Maestro, the god of music, who is banished by a certain chord being played. The conclusion of the episode doesn't make much sense, and just seems to me like RTD was just making stuff up on the spot, an easy and cheap way to conclude the story. Something which is done in arguably a worse way in the series finale, Empire of Death. As I mentioned earlier, the villain for this story is classic Who villain Sutekh, except he's refashioned as the god of death, something which doesn't make much sense but is largely irrelevant to my point. At the beginning of the finale, Sutekh wipes out all living things on planet Earth, and most of the universe, except for the Doctor and companions Mel and Ruby, as well as taking the TARDIS away from the Doctor. To defeat Sutekh, the Doctor lures the TARDIS towards him with a whistle, attaches Sutekh, the unstoppable, all-powerful god of death, to it via a rope, and hurls him through the time vortex, killing him, making everyone he killed come back. The logic to this is death to death equals life, another bullshit reason to defeat a villainous god that RTD once again just came up with in that instance. This is possibly the laziest conclusion to anything I've seen in fiction. Why does death to death equal life? How did the Doctor know this would work? There are literally no barriers or struggles whatsoever between the Doctor and Sutekh here, and he's defeated in the most rushed and pathetic way possible. But it's all excusable because now the show is subjective. In a fantasy universe where you're suddenly fighting a god and not an alien, the lines between what makes sense and what don't are blurred. But it doesn't have to be this way. I like the fact that the show now has elements of the fantasy genre and has fantasy villains, but that does not excuse lazy writing. This, thankfully, isn't as apparent in Series 15, except for one time. In Episode 2, the Doctor comes against Lux, the god of light, who has trapped innocent people in a film reel in a closed, barricaded cinema. Lux manifests himself as cartoon character Mr. Ring-a-Ding, and has ambitions of leaving freely in a more powerful form outside the cinema. But when the walls are bursted open by exploding film reels, light pours in, allowing Lux to infinitely expand and become one with the universe. This also felt like a last-minute decision that had very little thinking behind it, and it's a shame that Series 14 and 15 were written and filmed back-to-back, as if fans criticised the lazy writing regarding the fantasy constructs in Series 14, then perhaps RTD would be able to use this criticism to avoid it in this season. I, however, have not seen RTD ever mention the criticism of this type of writing at all, so if it persists in later seasons, then this will stand as one of the larger problems with this era of the show as a whole. Who knows what other members of the Pantheon we might see in the next season, if there is one, or even if Russell decides to carry on with the story arc. If he does though, I really hope it's done in a more creative and intelligent way. To be completely honest, this was, for me, the most disappointing aspect of the new era. I was excited to see Russell return to writing the show, as recent projects of his, Years and Years and It's a Sin, are some of the best examples of television in the last decade. However, I do think he should stick to projects such as these, and in my opinion, shouldn't stay as showrunner. Some of my favourite episodes of the new era, such as Boom, Rogue and Lucky Day, are some of the few episodes not written by Davis. The Fantasy Problem is one example of many instances of lazy writing in this era by RTD. To explain all of these would take a long time, but I think it's something which sours these two seasons especially, and I think something needs to be done about it if the show is going to return. It's a fact that in the modern age of media, not nearly as many people watch traditional, linear television anymore. The attention, particularly towards younger demographics, has been turned towards streaming services, most importantly Netflix, as well as Amazon Prime and Apple TV. BBC iPlayer, however, does not seem to be one of the more popular ones in the UK. I'm not entirely sure why this is, but I think it's just because people associate it with traditional television, and most of the content featured on iPlayer are shows that have broadcast on BBC channels. As Doctor Who is now on iPlayer, more recently now going online before it even airs, it's unlikely that people are going to watch it on broadcast, and why overnight figures are the lowest they've ever been. But now that Doctor Who is available to stream on Disney Plus worldwide, that means that it should reach millions of people and gain massive popularity. Well, no, it hasn't. Well, maybe the issue is that Disney Plus isn't the right streaming service to choose then. Perhaps if it was available to stream on Netflix worldwide, including the UK, then it should reach immense viral popularity, right? I don't think so. The reason why? Doctor Who is an irrelevant show. If in 2023, Doctor Who was bought by Netflix and started airing new seasons under a brand new reboot on the streaming site, it's hard for me to imagine it reaching the same level of popularity as shows such as Squid Game or Stranger Things, to name a few examples. I've seen countless videos calling Doctor Who outdated or irrelevant, particularly one by Stu Bagfull, where he makes a claim that episodes such as The Church on Ruby Road and Space Babies are more for a younger audience, particularly children, and episodes such as Empire of Death are catered more towards classic Who fans. The episodes in the middle that focus more on standalone concepts are for everyone, the type of people who would watch high quality and popular shows made for streaming, but they're more likely to start off by watching episodes that aren't made for them, get a bad impression, and turn off before they can watch them. There's also the problem that Doctor Who is a family show, meant for the whole family to watch in one evening, all sitting together in the living room. The issue with this is that this doesn't work with the streaming format, and is meant for two demographics: the parents, who are likely above 35, and children, who are likely under 13. The thing about the most popular Netflix and Apple TV shows is that they're targeted towards people in the middle, teenagers and young adults. And most of this comes with online virality, posted mostly by this age demographic. These streaming shows are meant for this demographic primarily, who don't watch linear television and choose to watch these programs on their own. Someone of this age range who has never seen Doctor Who before is extremely unlikely to decide to start watching it on platforms such as Disney Plus or BBC iPlayer because it's made for broadcast television. Most people watching the show this way are the inbuilt audience, the pre-existing fandom. As I mentioned earlier, the show pretty much only exists for the fans, and this is another reason as to why. But does this mean that Doctor Who should stop entirely? Well, in reality, I don't think the show is outdated. It's more of a question as to whether the BBC or traditional broadcast television is outdated, and the answer to that is not yet. There is still an audience for Doctor Who, as aforementioned, the family consisting of kids and parents and people who happen to be fans of the show. The BBC might drop their deal with Disney, but they won't drop Doctor Who. It remains by far their most merchandisable intellectual property. The fans will remain forever, and the family audience will remain as long as people are still interested in linear terrestrial television. At the moment, this is the over 40s, I'd say, but I could be wrong. As much as many fans might be turned off of Doctor Who from the desperation shown with the reality war, I'd say they'll still stick around to watch future episodes. As a sort of conclusion, I guess, it is still undeniable that Doctor Who is nowhere near as good as it was, quality or popularity-wise, and no matter how relevant it is in terms of keeping a selected audience, I worry about the future. The show has dug itself into quite a difficult hole with how they're going to continue the story based on the most recent particular cliffhanger, and is stuck in a dilemma between being obsessed with its past while also struggling to find new ideas and remain relevant. Because of this, I'd be willing to bet that it isn't long until this selected audience evaporates away. Less and less people are keen to watch traditional TV anymore, and some fans seem to be entirely disinterested in watching. And at the rate the show is going, I'm willing to bet that the fans who are still interested might move away to other things soon, just as I did, as this brand new enticing era proved to be anything but.